Everybody see me? All right, great. Well, thank you, Judge Fogel, and thank you, the organizers, a big thank you to the organizers for including this panel. As Lance mentioned at the outset, I am a neuroscientist, and the bulk of work that happens in my laboratory has to do with understanding how the human brain pays attention. And what we've been doing over the last decade or so is trying to really unpack what it is that might compromise attention, what degrades attention, what makes it vulnerable so that it's not functioning in tip-top shape. And through that work, we started investigating mindfulness training, mindfulness meditation training, as a way in which we may be able to train our own minds to improve attention, improve emotion regulation, and performance. And most of this has happened in my laboratory in particular with high-stakes, high-stress professions. And it may be no surprise to you that you all would fall into such a profession as judges and lawyers. And I just wanted to say at the outset, with the spirit of this panel, that they asked me we collectively decided that it'd be a good idea to give you a sense of the science, given that it's so central to my own research. But I also wanted to say that given that you all know how to be successful, and that's not the intention here. But what happens sometimes as we have professional success is that it's not always paired with a sense of clarity and kindness and compassion toward ourselves. And the kind of aspirational aspects of this panel is to introduce the idea that mindfulness training may allow you to have the tools to kind of pair both of those together, maintain and potentially even accelerate your success while also feeling good and okay in the process. Hopefully that's going to be of interest and value to all of you. So before we delve right into the science, I actually wanted to start by asking all of you a question. So here's the question. Does physical exercise improve physical health? If you think the answer is yes, please raise your hand. Okay, so that's every single hand in this room has been raised, right? And you might even say, well, that's sort of ridiculous. I thought you were a neuroscientist. You're asking a ridiculous question. And the reason I ask it is because I want to make a point regarding our cultural understanding regarding physical fitness. We all know, right? It's sort of so common for us to know this. But I would want to also highlight that we don't just come to this out of nowhere. We came to this cultural understanding through decades of dedicated research by scientists, similar to myself, who are asking not just if it is the case that physical activity is tied to physical well-being, but how it is that it might be that when you engage in this kind of activity, you improve in your wellness, right, in your physical wellness. And how do we do this? Well, they look at people that are engaging in physical activity and test out how the physiology might change during those periods of time. Or look at athletes, for example, or other people that regularly engage in physical activity and see how their baseline functioning might look different. We can also just take up measurements. Does the structure of the body change in people that regularly exercise? And finally, we can look at performance. So how is it that people exercising change in their ability to engage in this kind of activity? Right, so this is just to give you a sense that this comes from a whole body of research. Since 1980, there have been 300,000 articles published on the relationship between physical activity and physical health. And this has led our public health officials to be able to provide us with very precise, evidence-based recommendations on what we should do. So it's no mystery, right, of what we can, doesn't mean we always do it, but we know what we can do in order to promote our own physical wellness. So let's shift gears a little bit. How about this question? Does mental exercise improve psychological well-being? How many of you would say yes? Okay, well, I think that's many of you, but you didn't wander into this mindfulness panel on accident. So, so that's great that there's a room understanding of this. I would say broadly in our culture, that's not the case. And also, if I actually probed a little further and said, well, what exactly should you do? We'd have a diversity of opinion on what that is. And I would say our public health officials are not in a position today to offer us precise evidence-based guidance on what to do. And that's the spirit of my work. It's really to help promote that understanding so that beyond knowing that it's important, we can basically inform others on what we can do. All right? So one of the groups that has been interested in compiling what people are doing with regard to mental exercise is the National Institutes of Health. And they've compiled across a broad range of, basically the entirety of sampling across the entirety of the US population. And one of the types of activities people are doing more and more that they report as a mental exercise they do to improve their own well-being is meditation. And meditation, in this sense, is a broad term, an umbrella term, that has to do with engaging in certain daily practices to cultivate certain mental qualities. It's not really needing to be, as Judge Fogel mentioned, tied to any cultural, religious, or spiritual practice, though it can be. And what is it that they're doing this meditation practice for? What's the number one reason that they do this for? Well, their response is to combat stress. And when I use that term stress, I'm talking about, and maybe this might be kind of familiar to some of you, this sense of perceived unease, of overwhelm, of dysphoria, of maybe slight panic and irritation, something we would call distress. And just to be clear, this is not the kind of stress that is what we would call eustress, E-U in front of the word stress. That's really what gives us our edge, right? That kind of stress is actually quite beneficial. But people typically are not practicing mindfulness meditation in order to combat eustress. They want that. What they really do want to do is reduce the amount of distress. And you know, it's obvious to us now, probably, that stress is bad for the body. We know that the stress hormones that get released when we're under protracted periods of high stress can really damage every single major system in our body, the circulatory system, cardiac system, respiratory system, digestive system. We know this. And what we're coming to understand is not only is it bad for the body, but stress is quite damaging for the mind and in particular the attention system, which can unfortunately undermine everything we need to do in order to perform well in these high-stress situations. So I want us to unpack a little bit more why stress might be related to attention and how mindfulness may have a role to play in stress reduction. And this requires you to play along a little bit, and I want you to just for a few minutes entertain the metaphor of a stressed mind, sort of like an MP3 player, all right? So what the mind, the brain, the human brain is quite good at doing is mental time travel. And when we do this mental time travel, when we're under stress, we are typically in pressing the rewind button or fast forward, okay? And what happens when we do this? Well, when we press rewind, we're rewinding to the past. We're not just having a happy memory most of the time, especially if we're experiencing stress. We're ruminating, right? We're reliving, we're regretting, kind of stuck in this perpetual state where we kind of can't let go of pressing rewind. Or we're stuck in fast forward, where we're planning, catastrophizing, or worrying about events that may not even happen, right? And so that is problematic. It's problematic to be in this mental time travel mode. And what I'd like to convey to you is that sort of the opposite of a stressed mind is a mindful one. And this is where essentially we are keeping that button right on play so that we are present to and experiencing the moment-to-moment unfolding of our lives. Now that sounds like a great idea, right? It's like, yeah, I want to be present. And you might even think, well, I am present, I'm right here. But when you quiet a little bit, you might realize that in those moments that you think you're here, you're actually in the past or in the future. And many times that can be quite uncomfortable because you actually do want to be reading the brief in front of you, or having the conversation, or watching the soccer match, or enjoying the concert, or loving the view in front of you, this beautiful scenery. And you can't because your mind isn't actually in the moment. So the intention for mindfulness training is to actually provide exercises and programs that will help us cultivate a better ability to keep that button on play when we want to be in the present moment. Does that make sense? Okay. So let me just describe or define mindfulness, kind of similar to what Judge Fogel said. This is more of the academic definition, right? So mindfulness is a mental mode characterized by attention to present moment experience without conceptual elaboration or emotional reactivity. And that is quite a mouthful, but I think the metaphor is helpful, right? It's about living in the here and the now without a story about it. So we're not hijacked into mental time travel unknowingly or unwillingly. And when we can cut that cycle of always being in the past or the future, we can actually start having some understanding of what's happening to us and even reduce our experience of distress. All right, so now, mindfulness, it ends up, is now being quite prominently accepted and embraced by popular culture. So I'm just showing you some examples, and and of what we've been using mindfulness for. It's been now used in the context of professional sports, by major corporations, by newscasters, by members of Congress, and of course our military is now using mindfulness as a way to help with not only protection against stress-related diseases and disorders, but to really be at the top of the game, top of one's own game. And you might say, with this growing popularity, what happens to the research? Is the research on pace with the popular view of this? And this is showing you a graph from 1980 to 2015. You will see that there is an exponential uptick in the amount of research that's being done on mindfulness. But it's nowhere near 300,000 articles, which I think is why we're not at the cultural understanding yet as we are with physical activity. But this is to say that there is a growing interest and research, more and more research is being done on this topic. With all this research and with all this popular use of mindfulness, I get asked many times when I'm giving presentations about this, sort of a straightforward question from leaders in their communities. Usually this is in the context of me wanting to involve their groups in the research that we're doing. And the question is this: all right, lady, does it work? All right, just tell me if this is going to be a waste of time or worth it. And though this is a pretty straightforward question, a simple kind of question, it actually is kind of complicated. So one thing that we want to find out is, well, what do we mean by it? I described to you the definition of mindfulness and this kind of conceptual understanding that it's about being in the here and the now. But what really is it when we talk about mindfulness? And thankfully, now we're at a point where there are many opportunities for us to individually get exposed to and training in mindfulness. You can do it on your own by reading a book that sometimes will have a guided CD. You can download an app that you can get pinged to do daily 10-minute mindfulness exercises, or you can go to a local health clinic and receive a expert-guided program. One of the most commonly available programs is something called mindfulness-based stress reduction, which is available now at over 750 medical centers. And this program has an expert. The group comes in, usually 20 to 30 people. You meet for about 2.5 hours a week for 8 weeks. And this has been very helpful because it's a manualized program for us to be able to investigate and promote the understanding with regard to the science of mindfulness. So there are now many aspects of what it is in the does it work. And MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction, is a good contender for studying it. So that brings us to the next word in this question, work. What does it mean for something to work? And my broadest way of thinking about this is really, does this help reduce our own suffering in some way? And that suffering can happen in the body with chronic diseases that happen as a function of aging and stress and just life. It can be suffering that we experience in the mind, whether it's through full-blown psychological disorders like depression and anxiety, or it can be just a sense of dysphoria and discomfort. And with regard to relationships, our ability to communicate and connect with each other, whether it's in a professional context or a personal context. And so the research with regard to mindfulness is kind of branched out in these 3 different directions, using these standardized or manualized programs, offering them to people before and after, indexing functioning before and after the program is engaged in. And what I'm showing you here is just a kind of a sampling of some of the topics in which it's been investigated and found to have positive benefits. So chronic pain, hypertension, psoriasis. You might put the broad category of kind of autoimmune or inflammatory diseases. It's quite helpful for that. In the mind, we now have evidence that it's helpful for depression, anxiety, PTSD. And with regard to relationships, really a whole host of new research is happening in this area. With regard to marital relationships, more family dynamics, parent-child relationships, and workplace settings in which we can see that when one part of the team or multiple parts of the team are engaging in mindfulness exercises and get mindfulness training, the functioning and health and quality of relationship improves for the entirety of the team. So, now we're at a point, like I said, with this uptick in research, where we can take these individual types of questions that have been asked and kind of compile them into meta-analyses and review papers. And what I wanted to share with you is just a couple of these. This is one that came out a few years back. It was 47 studies published in really the premier journal, the one in which our president just published a paper actually yesterday, the Journal of the American Medical Association. And it was 3,500 patients. What they reported, again, this is not just like physical activity, it's not a panacea or a magic bullet. They reported moderate benefits, and specifically for anxiety, depression, and pain, lowering chronic pain. But I wanted to highlight one of the kind of concluding statements that they made, which was that the effects, though moderate, 10 to 20%, were comparable with what would be expected from the use of an antidepressant in a primary care population, but without associated toxicities. That, I think, is kind of compelling. So just as physical activity can help our body, engaging in mindfulness practices on a daily basis can actually have effects that are comparable to pharmacologic solutions without the downside of taking a drug to help. And more meta-analyses and results have been done. A more recent one was 215 randomized controlled trials with these manualized programs like mindfulness-based stress reduction, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, and those similar to the other study have found improvements with depression, anxiety, stress, quality of life, and physical functioning. So I'm showing this to you to kind of give you a sense that, look, this question of does it work, I think is a good one, and the evidence is amassing that looks in the right direction, right? So does mindfulness training work? Basically, the answer at this point would be yes. So that's it. That's the end of my talk. No, sorry. You're not done with me yet. No. It's not the end of my talk. I tricked you all. Can you put the slides back up? Sorry. Can you put the slides back up? So what I wanted to tell you is that just knowing something works should not be sufficient evidence for you all. You may buy it because it's coming from a neuroscientist, but I didn't buy it. Because to me, it was pretty strange that we find benefits from things as broad as psoriasis to better marriages. So what I was interested in understanding is what happens under the hood. Not just does it work, which is great, and hopefully that's enough to get you interested to giving it a try, but how? How is it that this thing could be helpful? And that's where, again, it comes back to my neuroscience training, and I'm going to ask questions with regard to the brain. So I wanted to just say a little bit about the brain. I know it's painful to do maybe at 10:40 on a last day of a conference, but bear with me, it won't be too bad, with a little brain science. So what we know is that mindfulness training, can you advance to the next slide, please? Okay, so mindfulness training, I've described it, I've given you a sense of what can happen with regard to all of these different programs that are available. I want to give you kind of at a granular level what might happen, and at the end of my few minutes left here, you will get a chance to just engage in this. So this is what would be kind of part of a foundational mindfulness practice, okay? And this is central to every program for all the benefits that have been observed. So what we ask people to do is to sit in a comfortable, upright, alert posture and focus all of your attention to the sensations of breathing. You don't necessarily have to do this right now, but we will in a moment. And what we then ask you to do is to select a sensation tied to breathing, very specific sensation, the coolness of air moving in and out of your nostrils, your abdomen moving out, in and out, whatever it is that you choose, you're going to pick that as the focus for where your attention will rest for the few minutes that we'll do the exercise. And that's the next part of the instruction. Just maintain your attention there. Just keep it right there. And then you'll notice pretty quickly that the mind has a mind of its own. It'll start wandering away from this boring focus of the breath. And the instruction at that point is just, if you noticed, when you notice your mind has wandered, gently return it. So the reason I've highlighted these words, select, maintain, notice, and mind wandering, is because as a scientist, those were key words that to me gave me some insight into what might be changing when people engage in these practices. And from the brain science, we know that there are identifiable brain networks that support these things. We know that attention, or the flashlight of the mind, has a very specific brain signature. We know that noticing, just being receptive to what's happening, has a different brain signature. And finally, when our mind is wandering, it has a very specific characteristic profile. And an important point to note is that when these different functions are happening, these brain networks are actually mutually inhibitory. So if you're mind wandering, you're going to have a much harder time selecting and maintaining focus or noticing what's going on around you, and vice versa. Okay, so what I wanted to mention to you is that now that we know the basic brain science, we now have a hunch about what might be happening with regard to brain changes. We have been able to offer people that are mindfulness practitioners the opportunity to come to our lab, get their brain scanned, and see if the structures and function in their brain look any different from having engaged in these practices. And the news seems to be that we are finding some good evidence so far. This is 21 studies that were done looking at structural changes, and they're all happening in regions that are nodes within these brain networks that I just described to you. So this is just like the physical exercise results in physical changes. We're seeing that mindfulness exercise results in mind or brain changes that are tractable. And we don't even have to just look at the brain, we can actually look at their performance. And the last thing I'll just mention to you is that when we bring people into the laboratory and have them do challenging tasks, they're sort of like video games, but quite challenging, to track how well they're able to perform on tasks of attention and working memory, we find positive evidence. So I just want to leave you with the hopefully I've communicated now that, you know, in the work in my own laboratory with high stress cohorts and many others, that mindfulness training does have a good deal of positive support, and that the evidence we're finding suggests it's definitely worth a try within the legal profession. So just to end now, you can really be done with me. Thank you all for your attention.